The wind howled outside the weathered cabin, rattling the shutters like angry spirits demanding entry, but Frank Blackburn hardly noticed anymore. 3 years of solitude had taught him to ignore such mundane threats, just as he'd learned to ignore the hollow ache in his chest that never quite went away. Frank stared at the dying embers in his fireplace, watching the orange glow fade to ash. February 1878 marked his third winter alone in this remote stretch of Wyoming territory. At 32, he'd grown accustomed to his own company, preferred it even. The nearest town, River Cross, lay 5 miles to the east, and he ventured there only when absolutely necessary for supplies or ammunition. His callous fingers absently stroked the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the Apache raid that had claimed not only his ranch hands, but also the last of his will to engage with the world. Sometimes he wondered if he should have died alongside them. It might have been easier than this half-life he now led. A sudden pounding at his door jolted Frank from his thoughts. Visitors were rare, especially during winter. With practiced caution, he reached for his Winchester rifle before approaching the door. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough from disuse. "Please," came a woman's voice, thin and desperate against the howling wind. "My wagon will broke 2 miles back. I've been walking. I saw your chimney smoke." Frank hesitated, then slowly pulled the door open, rifle still ready. Standing on his porch, shivering violently, was a woman bundled in a snow-dusted coat, her face partly obscured by a scarf. All he could see were her eyes, striking blue, wide with cold and fear. "Thank you," she breathed, stumbling inside as he stepped back. "I thought I might freeze before finding shelter." As she unwound her scarf, Frank's breath caught. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with auburn hair escaping from her bonnet and cheeks flushed from the cold. But what struck him most was the quiet dignity in her bearing, despite her obvious distress. "I'm Faith O'Connor," she said, extending a gloved hand that trembled slightly. "I was trying to reach Rivercross before nightfall." Frank realized he was staring and awkwardly took her hand. "Frank Blackburn." He set aside his rifle and gestured toward the dying fire. "Sit. I'll build that up." As he stoked the flames and added more wood, he kept stealing glances at his unexpected visitor. It had been so long since he'd had company, especially female company, that he hardly remembered how to act. "You're heading to Rivercross?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. Faith nodded, warming her hands before the fire. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher." The position opened suddenly when Miss Harrington married the banker's son and moved east. She paused, then added softly, "And I needed a fresh start." Something in her tone made Frank look more closely at her left hand. A thin, pale band of skin on her ring finger told him all he needed to know. "You're a widow," he stated rather than asked. Faith's eyes met his, surprise evident in them. "Yes. My husband Daniel died of typhoid fever last spring. It's been difficult." Frank nodded, understanding all too well. Loss had a way of hollowing a person out, leaving them a shell of who they once were. "You're welcome to stay the night," he offered, surprising himself. "The storm's getting worse. I can take you to town tomorrow." "I don't want to impose." "You aren't," he interrupted. "There's stew warming." "Not much, but it's hot." Faith smiled then, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and did something strange to Frank's chest. "Thank you, Mr. Blackburn. I'd be grateful." That night, Frank slept on a pallet near the fire, giving Faith his bed. The next morning, the snow had piled so high that travel was impossible. One night stretched into 2, then 3, as the storm raged on. During those days of forced companionship, Frank discovered Faith was easy to talk to. She didn't press when he fell silent, didn't demand details of his past. Instead, she helped with chores, mended a shirt he'd torn months ago and never bothered to fix, and shared stories of her own life before widowhood. By the fourth day, when the skies finally cleared, Frank found himself reluctant to make the journey to River Cross. But he'd given his word, so he hitched his horse to his small sleigh and prepared to take Faith to town. "I can never thank you enough for your kindness," Faith said as they approached River Cross. "Most men would have." She trailed off, but Frank understood. A woman alone was vulnerable in these parts. "Any decent man would have done the same," he replied gruffly. "Perhaps. But decency isn't as common as one might hope." When they reached the schoolhouse where Faith would be staying, Frank helped with her meager belongings, then stood awkwardly at the door. "Well, goodbye then, Mrs. O'Connor." Faith held his gaze for a long moment. "Would you allow me to thank you properly? Perhaps I could bring you a meal sometime? I make an excellent venison stew." Frank wanted to refuse. He'd built his solitude carefully, brick by brick, a fortress against further pain. But something in her eyes, perhaps a reflection of his own loneliness, made him nod. That would be nice. 2 weeks later, Frank was chopping firewood when he spotted a wagon approaching. His heart gave an unfamiliar lurch when he recognized Faith at the reins. She wore a blue dress that matched her eyes, and her hair was arranged more carefully than during her emergency stay. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackburn," she called, reining in her borrowed horse. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Frank set down his axe, suddenly aware of his unkempt appearance. "Not at all, Mrs. O'Connor." Faith smiled, reaching behind her seat to produce a covered pot. "I promised you stew, and I'm a woman of my word." Inside, as the rich aroma of venison and herbs filled the cabin, Frank watched Faith move about his kitchen with surprising familiarity. She'd brought not only stew but fresh biscuits and a jar of preserved peaches. It was the finest meal he'd had in years. "The children are quite challenging," Faith said as they ate, telling him about her new pupils. "Especially the Miller boys. They seem determined to test my patience at every turn." "Sounds like they need a firm hand," Frank commented. Faith laughed, the sound brightening the cabin like sunshine. "What they need is someone who believes in them. Their father works them too hard at the lumber mill. School is their only escape." As afternoon faded into evening, Frank found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone about his ranch in its better days, about his dream of breeding horses that had died along with his ranch hands. "You could still do it," Faith suggested quietly. "Your land is good. The pasture I passed would hold a decent herd." Frank shook his head. "That life is over." When Faith finally departed, Frank stood watching until her wagon disappeared around the bend. The cabin felt emptier than usual that night. To his surprise, Faith returned the following Sunday, this time with a pot of chicken soup and fresh bread. "I thought you might enjoy a change from your own cooking," she explained with a smile that suggested she knew his culinary skills were limited. These Sunday visits became a routine. Each week, Faith would arrive with food and stories from town, brightening Frank's solitary existence for a few precious hours. Sometimes she brought books from the small-town library, reading aloud while Frank worked on repairing tools or tending to chores he'd long neglected. One Sunday in late April, Faith arrived looking troubled. "What's wrong?" Frank asked, immediately concerned. "The Miller boys didn't come to school Friday," she explained. "I went to check on them and found their father had beaten them badly for being late to the mill. Tommy's arm might be broken." Frank felt a surge of anger. "Did you report it to Sheriff Taylor?" Faith's expression darkened. "The sheriff said it's a family matter. Miller contributes too much to this town for anyone to interfere." "That's not right," Frank said, pacing his small cabin. "No, it isn't," Faith agreed, watching him intently. "I've been thinking. I need to do something." "What can you do?" Faith took a deep breath. "I want to open my home to them, give them a safe place to stay. But as a woman alone." She hesitated. "It wouldn't be proper. People would talk." Frank understood what she wasn't saying. A widow taking in 2 boys without a man's protection would invite scandal and possibly danger. "I'll help," he said before he could think better of it. "I'll speak to Miller." Faith's eyes widened. "Frank, he's a dangerous man, so am I, when I need to be." The following day, Frank rode into town for the first time in months. People stared as he tied his horse outside the lumber mill, his determined stride, and the gun on his hip warning enough to keep curious onlookers at a distance. He found Miller supervising a log being cut, shouting profanities at a worker who wasn't moving fast enough. "Miller," Frank called, his voice carrying over the din of machinery. The mill owner turned, irritation crossing his face. "Who the hell are you?" "Frank Blackburn. I need a word about your boys." Miller's expression hardened. "My boys ain't none of your business, stranger." Frank stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm making it my business. The schoolteacher's concerned, and so am I." "That widow should mind her place," Miller sneered. "And so should you." "Your boys have 2 choices," Frank continued, ignoring the threat in Miller's tone. "Either you treat them proper, no more beatings, regular schooling, or they come stay with Mrs. O'Connor. She's willing to care for them properly." Miller lunged forward, grabbing Frank's shirt. "You threatening to take my sons, you bastard?" With a swift motion, Frank broke Miller's grip and shoved him back against a stack of lumber. "I'm offering you a chance to be a better father. Or to admit you don't want to be one at all." The mill workers had stopped, watching the confrontation with wary eyes. Miller glanced around, aware of the audience. "Get off my property," he growled. "Think about it," Frank replied calmly. "I'll be back tomorrow for your answer." As Frank walked away, he heard Miller shout, "Tell that widow she's finished in this town." Frank returned to the schoolhouse, where Faith was teaching. Through the window, he watched her for a moment, her gentle smile as she helped a small girl with her letters, the animated way she gestured during a story. Something warm bloomed in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling he wasn't ready to name. When school dismissed, he waited until the children had gone before approaching Faith. "How did it go?" she asked anxiously. Frank told her about the confrontation. "He's a proud man. Won't take kindly to interference." Faith's shoulders slumped. "I was afraid of that. What do we do now?" "We wait," Frank said. "And we prepare." That evening, Frank escorted Faith home and helped her prepare a space for the boys, just in case. They worked side by side, arranging 2 small beds in what had been her sewing room, talking quietly about what the boys might need. "Why are you doing this?" Faith asked suddenly. "You barely know these children." Frank paused, considering the question. "I know what it's like to be helpless, to have no one stand up for you." He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "No child deserves that." Faith reached out, her fingers brushing his scar with such tenderness that Frank nearly flinched. No one had touched him with such care in years. "You're a good man, Frank Blackburn," she whispered. "Better than you give yourself credit for." Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, Frank thought she might kiss him. Instead, she stepped back, a flush coloring her cheeks. "It's getting late," she murmured. "You should go." Frank nodded, though everything in him wanted to stay. "Lock your door," he instructed. "I don't trust Miller not to cause trouble." The next morning, Frank was preparing to ride into town when he spotted a wagon approaching at high speed. Faith was driving, and beside her sat 2 frightened-looking boys. Miller came to the school. Faith called as she reined in the horses. He was drunk, threatening to take the boys away somewhere. "I couldn't let him, you did right," Frank assured her, helping the boys down. The older one, no more than 12, had a splinted arm and bruises on his face. The younger, perhaps 9, clung to his brother with terrified eyes. "This is Tommy and James," Faith introduced them. "Boys, this is Mr. Blackburn." "Sir," Tommy acknowledged warily, positioning himself slightly in front of his brother. "You're safe here," Frank told them firmly. "No one's going to hurt you." Pa says he's gonna kill us for running off, James whispered. And Mrs. O'Connor too. Frank's jaw tightened. He'll have to go through me first. They brought the boys inside, and Faith busied herself making them something to eat while Frank kept watch outside. It wasn't long before he spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon, Miller and several men on horseback. Faith, he called, take the boys to the root cellar. Stay there until I call you. Frank, please, he interrupted. I don't want them to see this. Faith hesitated, then nodded, ushering the terrified boys toward the trapdoor in the kitchen floor. Frank checked his revolver and stepped onto the porch just as Miller and 4 other men rode into the yard. Where are my sons? Miller demanded, dismounting. The whiskey on his breath was evident even from several feet away. Somewhere safe, Frank replied evenly. Somewhere you can't hurt them anymore. Miller's face contorted with rage. You've got no right. They're my blood. Being a father is more than just blood, Frank countered. It's about protection, guidance, love. What would you know about it? Miller sneered. Everyone knows you're just some hermit who lost his mind after the Apache raid. Frank felt a flash of old pain but kept his expression neutral. Maybe I know more than you think. One of Miller's companions stepped forward. Look, Blackburn, just give the boys back and we'll forget this happened. No need for trouble. There's already been trouble, Frank replied. Those boys have the marks to prove it. Miller drew his pistol, his face flushed with drink and anger. I'm not asking again. Frank didn't flinch. Neither am I. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Sheriff Taylor's voice cut through the standoff. Put that gun down, Miller. Everyone turned to see the sheriff approaching on horseback, his deputy beside him. This ain't your concern, Taylor, Miller growled. When you ride armed into my jurisdiction threatening people, it becomes my concern, Taylor replied calmly, dismounting. Mrs. O'Connor came to me this morning with some disturbing information about how you treat those boys. She's lying. Dr. Jenkins examined Tommy's arm yesterday. The sheriff continued as if Miller hadn't spoken. Said it was broken by a blunt object, not a fall like you claimed. And Mr. Blackburn here isn't the only one who's noticed the bruises. Miller's companions exchanged uncomfortable glances, some backing their horses away slightly. Now, Taylor continued, you're going to holster that gun and come with me. We need to discuss your future, which I reckon might include some time in the territorial prison. This is bullshit, Miller shouted, but his hand was trembling now. They're my sons. Not anymore, Taylor said firmly. Judge Harrison signed papers this morning giving temporary guardianship to Mrs. O'Connor, pending a formal hearing. He looked pointedly at Miller's gun. Make this easy on yourself, Ed. For a terrible moment, Frank thought Miller might start shooting. But then the fight seemed to drain out of him, and he slowly lowered his weapon. You'll regret this, he muttered as the deputy took his gun and handcuffed him. All of you. After Miller and his companions had departed with the sheriff, Frank went to the root cellar and called down. It's safe now. Faith emerged first, her face pale with fear. What happened? Frank explained about the sheriff's intervention as the boys climbed out behind her. Tommy's expression was a mixture of relief and disbelief. He's really gone?
For good, he asked.
For a long while at least, Frank confirmed. That night, Faith and the boys stayed at Frank's cabin, the children sharing his bed while he and Faith took turns keeping watch from chairs near the fire. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the boys were soundly asleep, Faith finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. What happens now? Frank looked across at her, illuminated by the dying firelight. That depends on what you want. The town will talk, she said softly. A widow taking in 2 boys, spending nights at a bachelor's cabin. Let them talk. Faith's eyes searched his. It would be easier if... If what? Frank prompted when she trailed off. Faith took a deep breath. If I weren't alone in this. If there were someone else to help bear the responsibility. Frank felt his heart quicken. Are you asking for my help, Faith? I'm asking for more than that, she whispered. I've come to care for you, Frank. More than I thought possible after Daniel died. These past months, bringing you soup, sharing Sundays. They've been the happiest I've known in years. Frank moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. I've been alone so long, I forgot what it was like to want company. Until you knocked on my door that night. Faith's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Is that all I am? Company? No, Frank said firmly. Your hope. Life. Everything I'd given up on. He leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Faith closed the distance between them, her kiss tender yet certain. When they parted, Frank rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said, surprising himself with the words. Stay with me. We'll raise these boys together. Give them the home they deserve. Faith's smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered. Oh, Frank, yes. 3 weeks later, they married in Rivercross's small church. Tommy and James stood as witnesses, their faces solemn yet hopeful. The town had initially buzzed with gossip about the schoolteacher and the reclusive rancher, but Faith's steadfast dedication to her pupils and Frank's obvious devotion to his new family gradually won over even the most persistent critics. After the ceremony, they returned not to Faith's small quarters behind the schoolhouse, but to Frank's cabin, now their home. Frank had spent the intervening weeks expanding it, adding a proper room for the boys and making improvements Faith had gently suggested would make it more comfortable for a family. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Tommy and James chase fireflies in the yard, Faith rested her head on Frank's shoulder. When I brought you that first pot of soup, she murmured, I never imagined we'd end up here. Frank's arm tightened around her. I'm glad you were persistent. I'd have gone on being a hermit if you hadn't kept coming back. You just needed someone to remind you that life goes on, even after loss. We both did, Frank acknowledged, kissing the top of her head. By summer's end, Frank had acquired 2 young colts, the beginnings of the horse breeding operation he'd once dreamed of. Tommy showed a natural affinity for horses, spending hours helping Frank train them. James, quieter and more scholarly, often sat with Faith on the porch, reading from her collection of books or working on his lessons. Their first Christmas as a family was a joyous affair. Frank cut a pine tree from the nearby forest, and Faith decorated it with ornaments she and the boys had crafted together. They exchanged simple gifts. Frank gave Faith a silver locket containing a tiny portrait of the 4 of them that he'd commissioned from a traveling artist. Faith presented Frank with a new saddle she'd saved for months to purchase. As spring arrived, bringing new life to the ranch, Faith shared news that completed their happiness. She was expecting a baby. Frank, overwhelmed with emotion, held her as if she were made of precious glass. Are you happy, Frank? Faith asked one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch, her hand resting on her growing belly. Frank looked at their home, at Tommy teaching James to throw a lasso in the yard, at the small herd of horses grazing in the pasture, at the woman who had brought light back into his darkness. I spent so long convinced I didn't deserve happiness, he said softly. That surviving when others didn't was some kind of punishment. Faith squeezed his hand. And now? Frank smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his once solemn face. Now I know it wasn't punishment. It was preparation. I had to wait for you. In September, Faith gave birth to a daughter they named Hope, a perfect blend of her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes. As Frank held his newborn child, with Tommy and James peering anxiously over his shoulders, he marveled at how completely his life had changed in less than 2 years. From a man who had slept alone in his cabin for years, convinced that solitude was his fate, to the head of a growing family, surrounded by love and purpose. All because a widow had brought soup and stayed for love. 5 years later, the Blackburn Ranch had prospered beyond Frank's wildest dreams. Their home had expanded to accommodate not only Hope but also the twin boys Faith had delivered the previous winter. Tommy, now 17, had become Frank's right hand in the horse business, while James excelled at school and spoke of attending university in Denver someday. Faith had given up her teaching position after Hope's birth, but still tutored local children who struggled with their studies. The community that had once whispered about them now pointed to the Blackburns as an example of what determination and love could accomplish. On the anniversary of the day Faith had first brought soup to his cabin, Frank surprised her with a picnic by the stream that ran through their property. As they watched their children play in the shallow water, supervised by Tommy, Frank took his wife's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Tying your life to a broken man like me?" Faith's eyes, still as blue and bright as the day they met, filled with tenderness. "You were never broken, Frank. Just wounded. And wounds heal with proper care." She leaned against him, fitting perfectly into his embrace, as she always had. "Besides, I got the better end of the bargain. A wonderful husband, beautiful children, and a life filled with more joy than I ever thought possible after Daniel died." Frank kissed her then, still marveling that this remarkable woman had chosen him, had seen worth in him when he'd forgotten it existed. "Thank you for bringing me soup," he whispered against her lips. Faith laughed, the sound still his favorite music. "Thank you for letting me stay." As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting golden light across the land they had nurtured together, Frank Blackburn knew with absolute certainty that he was the richest man in Wyoming territory. Not in gold or acres, but in the currency that truly mattered: love, family, and the courage to begin again after loss. The lone wolf had found his pack, the widow had found new joy, and together they had created something neither could have imagined in their darkest hours: a future bright with promise and a love strong enough to weather any storm the frontier might bring.